JPJ and Bijan got snubbed at NFL honors, but I don't think anybody should be mad about it.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the last call for football over at FanDuel. And if you're a new customer, just bet $5 and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if that bet wins. Of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalconsFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we'll be sharing our thoughts on the so-called snubs for Bijan Robinson and James Pearce Jr. In terms of the NFL honors and various awards. But the bulk of today's episode will be wrapping up our defensive positional breakdowns of the safety position, talking about what I think is arguably the best safety duo in the NFL, and Xavier Watts and Jessie Bates, and why and how Xavier Watts excelled so much as a rookie to get nominated for one of those NFL honors awards, which we'll discuss, and why I think the talk and rumors about the Falcons potentially shopping Jessie Bates and moving on from him this offseason doesn't make a ton of sense. And we'll also touch upon briefly a potential shifting role for Billy Bowman, maybe a potential move back to his natural safety position, which maybe makes a little bit more sense for him in the future. But starting off with those NFL honors conversations, no wins for Bijan Robinson and James Pearce Jr. on Thursday night for NFL honors. Bijan up for Offensive Player of the Year, James Pearce Jr. up for Defensive Rookie of the Year, Xavier Watts also up for Defensive Rookie of the Year. But, I'm not sure how many people expected Watts to win that award, but I think a lot of people had expectations. I know at least Falcon fans in the state of Georgia had expectations that Pearce would potentially win Defensive Rookie of the Year. But we'll circle back to Pearce in a second. Let's talk about Bijan. And I saw some people talking up Bijan's historic year. Tweets and Instagram posts or whatever saying Bijan is the first player in NFL history to rush for over 1,400 yards and 800 yards receiving in a season, and that's never been done before. And doing just a little bit of research, and it's like that's not true, right? Steven Jackson did it in 2006 when he had 1,500 yards rushing and over 800 yards receiving. He led the league in scrimmage yards that year, similar to how Bijan led the league in scrimmage yards this year. But even Steven Jackson didn't win Offensive Player of the Year that year, because that was the year, for those of you that are old enough to remember, that was the year that LaDainian Thomas scored 31 touchdowns that season. But so when I see people saying like, "Oh, Bijan should have won it because he had a historic season," it's like that's not really true. He had a very productive season, one of the better running back seasons in NFL history, in terms of both as a runner and receiver, but not enough to be like this is singular the reason to win. So it's not to say that Bijan wasn't deserving of winning Offensive Player of the Year, but it just felt like I saw a lot of Falcon fans on Thursday night and Friday morning being like, "Oh, he got robbed," based off of this false assumption that he had a historically significant season. And then with Pearce, another deserving player for Defensive Rookie of the Year, I'm sorry. Myles Garrett obviously swept Defensive Player of the Year honors, but Carson Schwetzinger, the Browns linebacker, won it. And to me, it was kind of writing was on the wall when I saw the breakdown of the All-Pro voting, which is also voted by the Associated Press, who votes for these awards that we're talking about, because Schwetzinger did get some All-Pro votes and Pearce did not. And it was like, okay, like Schwetzinger is probably going to win it. But to me, what was really surprising was how much of a runaway winner that Schwetzinger was, where he got 40 out of the 50 votes. I thought Nicky Manwari, the Seahawks safety / DB nickel, would give Schwetzinger more of a run for his money than I thought James Pearce would. Manwari only got 7 votes. Pearce got 2. Watts only got 1. I thought it would be a lot closer to that rather than Schwetzinger running away. And so, it's one of those things where that surprised me, but not necessarily that James Pearce didn't win. Now, I'm sure some of you guys are like, "Oh, of course, Aaron doesn't think, as the world's biggest Falcons hater, doesn't think any of these guys were deserving." And it's like, that's not what I'm trying to say. Like, I think all of these guys were deserving. I think, whether we're talking about the Falcons players or any of these guys that were finalists, that's the whole point of them being finalists for this, because how it works is you're only a finalist if at least one of the voters, that votes for this thing thinks you should have won. But it's really just more about how I kind of view awards like this. And this doesn't just apply for the NFL and other sports, but it also applies for, other elements of fandom like movies and TV and music and whatnot. That like part of, for me at least, is like it's not about external validation, right? Like I know how good Bijan Robinson is, right? So him not winning Offensive Player of the Year does not really bother me in a major way, just like it wouldn't bother me if Sinners, doesn't win Best Picture for Oscars, just to use an example, because it winning Best Picture for Oscars, doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the movie, right? And to me, that's really what it's about. It's like your enjoyment of the player, right? The things that matter to me is the joy I get watching Bijan Robinson walk on water every single Sunday, as well as the joy I get, or that I get when the Falcons win games, which it feels so like it's such a distant memory when that was the case. But to me, the rest of this stuff is a kind of BS and fluff, and so that's why, like, I get why people will be like, oh, the Falcons got robbed or whatever. And if you care about that external validation that comes from these awards and whatnot, then keep on keeping on doing what you do. Don't let, some guy on the internet tell you how to live your life. But I know to a lot of folks, it's like, oh, Aaron, of course you're a contrarian, but like a lot of it is just because like I can see both sides of the argument, right? Particularly when it comes to stuff like this, where it's like, I can see why Carson Schwetzinger won. I can see why James Pearce should win. I can see why you would make the case for any of these guys winning. And it's rather than just being like, okay, well, one, side of the argument is clearly right and the other one is wrong. It's just like, it's like, it just depends on your perspective. And then to me, that ability to kind of see both sides of the argument, I think is a strength, not a weakness. I'm sure other people disagree with that, and it's how oftentimes on this podcast, we can look at, the side of the argument, one side of the argument one day on the pod, and then the next day look at it different. I go back to, that post, that week after the Penix pick, where one day we spent talking about the opportunity cost that the Falcons had, where they could have helped the rest of their roster rather than double dipping at the quarterback position. And then the next day we talked about, well, here's why the Falcons did what they did, and here's their vision, and here's how it could work. And it's the idea of giving you guys both sides of the argument so that you can make an informed decision, as opposed to me sitting here being like, this is the correct opinion. Although I know there are some times where, and we'll probably get to some talking points today when we talk about the safety position, where I'm like, here's the correct opinion. And, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. But like, sometimes I think that's, a valid place to be. But those are kind of my thoughts on the NFL honors. So disappointing. It would have been nice to sit here for the next 6 months and in addition to talking about Bijan being that blue magic and Mr. Walk on Water, being like, oh yeah, and also defending Offensive Player of the Year, and same thing with James Pearce or Xavier Watts being the defending Defensive Rookie of the Year. But at the end of the day, like, I'm not going to lose any sleep over these guys not necessarily winning those honors. I think they were certainly deserving. I can certainly understand why others feel like this is a miscarriage of justice. I've been joking in the Locked On Falcons Discord. It's funny that we hire Kevin Stefanski, and ever since he leaves Cleveland, like, the Browns get more and more accolades, like 2 Pro Bowl quarterbacks in Flacco and Shedeur Sanders, Defensive Rookie of the Year in Schwetzinger, Defensive Player of the Year in Myles Garrett. And like, the narrative on Kevin Stefanski was like, oh, well, Cleveland was a dumpster fire. And it's like, well, clearly they had some things going for them this year, even if you think some of those things are inflated. And I've just been joking with people. It's like, well, is Kevin Stefanski really a good coach if, he had 2 Pro Bowl quarterbacks and, 2 of the best defensive players in the NFL? Like, the fact that the Browns only went 0-17 or whatever, and I'm joking when I say that, is that a sign? So it's just funny to me that, like, we keep sort of pushing this area, like, oh, of course, Kevin Stefanski is going to come to Atlanta and be successful, and because the cupboard was so bare in Cleveland. And it's just like, ever since the end of the season, it's like Cleveland keeps seeming like, at least on surface, again, whether you think it's the reality, seems like, it wasn't that bad in Cleveland with all these postseason honors that all these current and former Browns players keep getting. So that'll be interesting to sort of see how that ages, obviously. So, that's just funny to me that the Browns just keep winning awards. And it's like everybody is like, the Browns are a dumpster fire, but they keep sweeping all these awards and keep putting players in the Pro Bowl. So that's just funny. But let's talk more about Xavier Watts, who was snubbed And last thing I'll say, shout out to Bijan for showcasing the DJ skills of the NFL honors. That was really the highlight of the night, not necessarily winning the awards, but being the DJ over at the NFL honors show. But let's talk more about Xavier Watts, why he was a standout rookie season despite not winning defensive rookie of the year. And we'll also talk about how Jessie Bates has been a positive, depending on your perspective, influence on him. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, finding the right doctor can actually feel like you're discovering a diamond in the rough. You want to find someone that's in network nearby with availability. You want someone who listens, who you feel comfortable with, explains things clearly, and helps you walk out feeling confident about your next step. And your diamond in the rough doctor does exist, and you can find them easier with ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so that you can choose someone you truly connect with. The thing that ZocDoc gives you is you can choose between in-person and video visits. That's going to make scheduling easier. You don't have to worry about phone tag because it's going to give you real-time availability, and it's going to give you options at a variety of doctors, primary care, dentistry, so much more. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments. Go to ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL to find and instantly book the doctor that you're going to love today. That's ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL. It's ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL. Thank you for ZocDoc for sponsoring today's message. And also, today is sponsored by Indeed Sponsored Job. They're going to help you find the right match when it comes to hiring, right? Sometimes your hires look good on paper and you find out they're not the right fit. Now, Indeed is all you need when it comes to you hiring. Stop struggling to get your job posts seen on other websites. Indeed Sponsored Jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates that check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And you can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL to support support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. So I want to plug the Everydayer Club, where you can level up your everydayerness. We thank all of you that make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. You are the Everydayers, and you are the reason why Locked On is #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. But you can level up by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at LockedOnFalcons.supercast.com. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you get some great perks, ad-free version of the podcast, Locked On Podcast Network, Discord access, as well as sweet, sweet Locked On merch like I'm wearing on your cameras on YouTube. So go check it out in the link in the description below. So let's talk about Xavier Watts. Obviously had an outstanding rookie season to be one of the 4 finalists for Defensive Rookie of the Year. If you're an everydayer of this podcast, you're not surprised because we were pounding the table for Xavier Watts. We thought he was going to be the rookie that had the best bet to impact right away. Fortunately for the Falcons, the rest of the defensive rookie class also far exceeded our expectations in that regard and also impacted in significant ways early in the season. The one big question we had for Xavier Watts was, would some of the athletic physical limitations that he had, some of the concerns about the speed, the range, the toughness and run support, would that lower his ceiling as a safety? Like we thought he had a high floor, but we wondered how high is the ceiling without some of those traits, those plus traits from an athletic standpoint. And, the answer to that question was it didn't lower his ceiling, right? As we saw with his impact this past year. We were hopeful that given the fact that safety is such a quote unquote neck up position, he would be able to overcome some of those physical limitations because of how smart and savvy and instinctual safety he was. And that lived up to the hype. Occasionally some of those limitations showed up, but he was able to overcome it with solid tackling technique, generally taking good angles to the football, and having that excellent feel for coverage that even if he isn't necessarily the fastest guy in a straight line, running at 4.65 or 40 or whatever it was, he was able to, make up the difference by always being a step ahead and being in a position and rarely out of position, particularly playing that, deep center fielder role that the Falcons often asked him to do. And so To me, the only real flaw in Xavier Watts' rookie season was occasionally he got exposed in man coverage, right? But as we discussed the other day with the cornerbacks, with the Falcons potentially leaning more on their man coverage moving forward as they work to continue upgrading their secondary, I think the vision for Xavier Watts is, in those situations, he's going to continue to be that single high safety. When they deploy that cover one, rather than the guy that's going to need to lock down the tight ends and wide receivers in that man coverage. Instead, that specific role, at least for the foreseeable future, is probably going to be filled more by Jessie Bates, potentially could be filled by Billy Bowman in the future. More on that later. And so I don't think this quote unquote flaw in Xavier Watts' game is really going to be that detrimental to his bright future in Atlanta. So, a lot of good with Xavier Watts' rookie season. The thing that stood out the most, though, watching the film, was his lack of commitment to monogamy. And if you're an everydayer of this podcast, you understand what I'm referencing when I say that. But if you're relatively new, let me explain. There's been a long-running bit on this podcast since 2023 about Jessie Bates being a non-monogamous safety or non-monogamous king because he likes to cheat in coverage, right? And that basically means, whatever the role he's supposed to do on the play that's drawn up, sometimes he'll go off script, right? Because he'll use those instincts. He'll use that film study and anticipate what the offense is doing and do the thing that in theory he's not supposed to do. And he can catch quarterbacks unaware, and had a great success doing this in 2023 against guys like Bryce Young and Derek Carr and Tim Boyle, and then had continued success in 2024. Although, we talked about how it kind of burned them a couple of times late in the season against Washington in that week 17 game that last year. And then this year he got burned a few more times, right? And when we discuss Jessie Bates later in this episode, I think a couple of those instances of him cheating and getting burned fueled some of the criticism that he had, especially early in the season, but we'll circle back to that later in the episode. But to me, when it comes to Xavier Watts, started noticing him, following in Jessie's footsteps, starting in that game in Germany against the Colts in week 10. And that continued as a trend throughout the back half of the season and culminated with sort of the highlight of his non-monogamous ways in that week 17 game against the Rams, where that second interception he had late in the game, I believe it was the 4th and 1, where I believe he bailed on his coverage against, I think it was Xavier Smith. That would have been a touchdown if Stafford had seen it. But he jumped the throw to Terrence Ferguson underneath and picked it off and nearly took it to the house before stepping out of bounds. And, we celebrate instances like this because the everydayers know that we here on Locked On Falcons, we do not believe in monogamy. And, we thought Xavier Watts was going to be that monogamous safety to kind of cover for Jessie when he was out there cheating. If you're following what I'm putting down, right? But to see him embrace non-monogamy was certainly a pleasant surprise, right? And we have our principles here on this podcast. You got to have principles, right? And again, quoting this individual during Black History Month is probably problematic. But in the words of Kanye West, love is cursed by monogamy. It's something that the pastor doesn't preach. It's something that the teacher doesn't teach. But we here on Locked On Falcons, we preach it, we teach it. Love is cursed by monogamy. Of course, it is a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways, right? It can burn you as well as, be the thing that wins you the game. But again, we practice what we preach here. I've started reading the book Sex at Dawn. It's a part of my off-season reading list, right? It talks all about how, monogamy is unnatural to human cultures and all that stuff. Go check it out. And so I know many of you guys believe that monogamy works for you, and it probably does work for you, right? That's fine, right? But don't shame the rest of us because we live an alternative lifestyle, including Xavier Watts. So Xavier Watts, I say to you, I see you, I support you, and I look forward to you spreading the gospel of how love is cursed by monogamy. It is in a natural, it's a social construct invented by human beings that is taking away and leading to the detriment of our society. So, X didn't clearly learn this philosophy in a vacuum, okay? But he had a good teacher. He had a good preacher, right? His sensei, his senpai, known as Jessie Bates, right? And we'll talk more about the senpai, right? And there's a lot of buzz about trading Jessie Bates. And I'll explain why I don't think that's, that buzz is wrong, right? Let's quiet that buzz and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, what if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house, it's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when the momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the US. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap merchant. Now, it is a new year, and that means lots of people are trying to eat healthier. They're trying to simplify their lives. And one way that you can do that is with easy, reliable dinner plans. And that's why I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Home Chef. Home Chef is going to take the stress out of cooking by delivering fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients right to your door with easy to follow recipes that actually taste great. They're rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And it's easy to see why, right? Home Chef meals come ready to fit your schedule with a wide variety of options. You can order family-sized meals, quick lunches. There are plenty of options for, different dietary choices. So, if you're also looking to save money in 2026, Home Chef has got you. Customers on average save $86 per month on groceries. So for a limited time, Home Chef is offering our listeners 50% off your first box, plus free shipping, plus free dessert for life. Just go to homechef.com/lockedon to check it out. That's homechef.com/lockedon for 50% off of your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. You must be an active subscriber to receive that free dessert. So let's just say it. I think Jessie Bates had an excellent season, but I think the perception is that he had a down year. And while I think it's fair to say that 2025 was Jessie Bates' worst season since joining the team in 2023, I don't think that automatically translates to him having a down year. I think, particularly in the first half of the season, Jessie Bates played lights out, but I think the perception of his performance was more negative than what the reality was. And I think that's fueled by the lack of interceptions and production there, plus a handful of times where his cheating got him into trouble. But as we say, we do not believe in monogamy, so we don't necessarily criticize the cheating as much as maybe other people do. Again, we're not going to go into a rant about, watching the film versus watching the TV copy, but in a lot of ways, if you're not watching all 22, you're going to miss like 90% of what's going on in the secondary. And so your perception of what's actually happening in secondary is probably wrong. But, I think in the first half of the season, like Jessie Bates on a 10-point scale was like playing like a 9 level. It just wasn't reflected in terms of interceptions and whatnot. And then the play probably dipped in the second half, but down to like a 7 out of 10. So that's what I mean, where like I don't think it was a down year for him. And so when Bates is earning second team All-Pro honors, I think that's very much deserved based off of the performance I saw, in contrast to, say, Chris Lindstrom, who earned those honors, where I think that was more reputation than based off of his performance specifically in 2025. I'm not saying Lindstrom was bad this year, but it was more like a 7 out of 10 season. And it's like, is that really All-Pro? Whatever. But, when it comes to Bates, and this is something that I've seen sort of pick up steam a lot in the last few days, but it's been a talking point I've heard for the last few months, is whether or not the Falcons should try to move him via trade. And a lot of it seems to stem from Ian Cunningham's presser, the new GM, talking about how much he loves picks, and people sort of looking for like, okay, how can the Falcons pick up picks, to fuel Ian Cunningham's obsession and adoration for them, which basically involves like, who can we trade? And Jessie Bates' name is one of the names I've seen come up. And I'll say this up front, just so my biases are clear. It's not to say that I don't think it matters, but I don't think it's that important for the Falcons to gain as much draft capital in 2026 as it is for the Falcons to gain draft capital in 2027. Because for me, 2026 is much more of an evaluation year for this new regime in terms of trying to figure out what they like about this roster and to build upon it. And so having more picks in 27 is going to probably move the needle a lot more for them to do that once they have a more informed assessment of the roster and what areas they need the most help in than 2026, where you're just kind of guessing at this point in time. And then this is also related to what I think is the wrong mindset, where that we've seen the Falcons operating a lot more with Terry Fontenot the last couple of years, which is much more geared towards short-term thinking than long-term thinking. And then B, I don't think trading some of your best players to get mid-round picks is going to move the needle that much in a positive way. Like, I'm assuming that you could trade Jessie Bates and probably get a third-round pick. Maybe you can get a second-round pick, maybe worse than that, whatever. Is that going to help you win games more than what Jessie Bates is going to help you win in 2026? Again, if the goal is to win games in 2026, now, if the goal is we're tanking in 2026, then I think you can absolutely justify trading a Jessie Bates. And while, maybe there's a world where I would endorse that message, I don't think the Falcons are going to endorse that measure. I certainly don't think Arthur Blank is going to endorse that measure. Now, you say, of course, Aaron, like, we're not trading Jessie Bates. You just said it. It's about the long-term mindset, and that third round pick or whatever could really work out long-term. It's like, sure, in theory it could, but as we learned with the Matt Ryan and Julio Jones trades, your odds of hitting on that day 2 pick is much lower than I think people realize. It's like maybe 30% chance on average for either a second or third round pick. And that's just the 30% chance that guy turns into just a quality starter for you, let alone a difference maker on the level of a Jessie Bates, where he's, again, one of the best safeties in the NFL, even at his, advancing age. And then on top of that, you're not really saving a lot of money, right? 2026 is the final year of Jessie Bates' contract, but because of the restructures the Falcons have done over the last 2 years, they're not going to free up that much space by moving off of him, right? They'd free up about $6.5 million by trading him before the draft to get that 2026 draft capital, and they would still be eating about $18 million in dead money, right? And his current cap hit is a little shy of $25 million, which is high, but it's not some backbreaking number where you're like, oh, well, Jessie Bates is not worth $25 million. I'm sure other people will disagree with that, but like, he is the leader of your defense. He's still one of the best players, if not the best player on your defense. And again, still playing at a high level, like, paying that guy $25 billion to me still makes a ton of sense. So trading him doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Again, I think it's this mentality of like, we got to trade guys, we got to restructure guys, we got to maximize our cap space, we got to maximize our draft picks in 2026. And it's like, for what, right? Like I said, 2026 is much more of an evaluation year, I think, for this new regime. And going on this offseason spending spree in free agency with $50 million in cap space doesn't make a ton of sense at this point in time. And as someone who is normally in favor of the Falcons doing stuff in free agency, as a podcaster and content creator here, I know it may sound hypocritical to some of you, but it's like, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to charge up the credit card, which is what this we're talking about with these restructures and moving off of this money is really beneficial to this new regime at the start of their time. So to me, when I look at Jessie Bates, I'm much more interested in potentially extending Jessie Bates and moving off of him in the near future. Right now, I think you got to wait and see how 2026 plays out, so that you can once again make a more informed decision in 2027. But it's similar to what the Cardinals did a couple of years ago, back at the end of 2024 with Budda Baker, where they basically extended him, gave him 2 years of guaranteed money. In Jessie Bates' case, that would be extending beyond 26 and locking him in through 27 and 28. Which would lock him in through the end of Xavier Watts and Billy Bowman's rookie deals. And then you could, at the time when it's time to pay those guys in the offseason of 2029, then you could move off of Jessie Bates if you feel the need to do so, which you probably would at that point in time. Now, that to me is a much better strategy. Now let's talk a little bit more about Billy Bowman to wrap up today's episode. As I mentioned when we were breaking down the cornerback position, his Achilles injury, I think, is going to be detrimental for him to stick at nickel as a starting level player. Basically, my stance is, whether it's re-signing D. Alford or signing somebody else, I think it would be smart for the Falcons to sign at least a bridge nickel cornerback, if not try to find more of a long-term, solution at that position that has a little bit more upside, a true cornerback rather than what Billy Bowman is, which is this sort of hybrid role. And I think you embrace the hybrid role that Billy Bowman has and make him more of the dime safety, where he can be the third safety. He can play some nickel if need be as that sixth defensive back, where I think his versatility is much more valuable in that role than it is purely as a nickel. And especially if you're, totally against the idea of extending Jessie Bates, as I'm sure some of you are and are already angrily typing your comments below. Um, I think giving Bowman more looks at safety could potentially stop you from, locking in more money and giving more money and locking in, Jessie Bates more long term. And Billy Bowman can be that pivot point for you potentially from doing that. If you see that as detrimental to the team. But you got to kind of see how both 2026 plays out for both of these guys, right? And Bowman coming off the Achilles, Jessie Bates, if there is, significant drop off for him this upcoming season. And so you kind of wait till the end of October, see where Bates is at. And if he's in a good place, you can start your extension talks. Or if not, then you can kind of spend the rest of the year being like, okay, let's give Bowman a little bit more of a serious run at safety. And so that we can make an informed decision if we're going to let Jessie Bates walk, following offseason in 2027. So, again, it's about making informed decisions in 27 as opposed to, making big commitments in 2026. So wrapping up, let's talk about the rest of the safety depth quickly. DeMarco Hellams ended the season on IR with a hamstring injury, but I imagine that's not going to be too problematic for him in 2026. But you never know. We love Hellams' play style against the run, but his coverage limitations, I feel like, continue to get exposed the longer he's been in Atlanta. And even though he only played 13 snaps on defense this year, if you're watching the film, you saw like 3 times where it's like, oh, DeMarco, what are we doing in coverage, right? And that's just too high a percentage to really trust him to be your first option in the event of a long-term injury to either Watts or Bates, right? But he still has a lot of value on special teams. He still can add some depth there. Jamie Robinson, who by the way was my floor comp for Billy Bowman last year, showcased some really good special teams value in that the regular season finale against the Saints with a block punt. And so could be back to compete for depth as potentially a fourth safety as well, pushing Hellams in that regard. But I do think it would be smart for the Falcons to, bolster their competition, bolster their depth with a cheap veteran, maybe a late round pick or something at the safety position. But again, I think Bowman should be your top option as your top, your third safety that is your top backup in the event of an injury to Bates or Watts. And I think that would be a smarter plan for the Falcons at safety in terms of their depth than, having Hellams or Robinson in that role. But we'll see how it all plays out. That's it for the safety conversation. We have one more of these. Now the defense is wrapped. We got to talk about that third phase, which is, of course, special teams. We know it matters. We'll be back tomorrow with another weekend show for you guys and wrap up these positional breakdowns before we get to the Super Bowl so that we can officially pivot away from talking about 2025 and only talking about 2026, although I'm sure we'll still continue talking about 2025 at various points. But that will be the plan for you guys. And then we might also get into what is the situation for the Falcons at quarterback, right? That's an ongoing topic of conversation because of all these various talking points about, what did this guy say about Michael Penix and what did Michael Penix, so that will be also potentially on the table for tomorrow's special teams breakdown as well. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On Seahawks, Locked On Patriots to get your last, previews and breakdowns of this upcoming Super Bowl 60 matchup. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below, lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, $5 a month or $50 a year for lots of perks. Go check it out. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.